The days following that charity dinner were a whirlwind for Evelyn. Those green eyes that had captured her for an instant never left her mind, chasing her even in her dreams. The routine that once seemed suffocating was now unbearable. On a particularly tense afternoon, Evelyn found herself in Thomas's office, watching him work furiously on his laptop. "Thomas," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "do you remember the last time we went on vacation? Just the two of us?" Thomas barely looked up. "Evelyn, honey, you know we don't have time for this. The merger with the Johnson Company is underway and there will always be another merger, another deal, another excuse," Evelyn interrupted, her voice thick with bitterness. That made Thomas stop. He stared at her, surprised by the sudden outburst. What's gotten into you?" Evelyn felt tears burning in her eyes. I don't know if I can go on like this, Thomas. I feel like I'm disappearing." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stood up slowly, approaching her with an expression that mixed confusion and irritation. "Disappearing? Evelyn, look around you." He gestured to the panoramic view of Manhattan. "You have everything you ever wanted. What more could you want?" The words hit Evelyn like a slap. She stepped back, feeling the chasm between them widen even further. "Maybe I want something money can't buy," she muttered, quickly leaving the office. Days later, Evelyn wandered aimlessly through the Metropolitan Museum of Art, looking for an escape. That's when she saw him again, the green-eyed man from the charity dinner. "Sorry, I couldn't help but notice you look lost," he said, his voice soft and melodious. Evelyn felt her heart accelerate. Maybe I am." Jack," he introduced himself, holding out his hand. "Evelyn," she replied, feeling an electric current pass between them as their hands touched. They spent hours talking, Evelyn feeling truly seen for the first time in years. Jack was an artist, his eyes sparkled when he talked about his passion for painting. "You should come to my studio sometime," Jack suggested, an enigmatic smile on his lips. Evelyn knew she should refuse, but the words that came out were, "I'd love to." That night, lying next to Thomas, who was sleeping soundly, Evelyn felt her heart divided. Guilt and excitement battled within her as images of Jack danced in her mind. Days turned into weeks, and Evelyn found herself living a double life. With Thomas, she maintained the facade of the perfect wife, but her afternoons were filled with secret visits to Jack's studio. "You're my muse, Evelyn," Jack whispered one day, his fingers tracing the outline of her face. "Let me paint it." Evelyn knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop. The passion she felt for Jack was overwhelming, consuming her completely. Meanwhile, Thomas became increasingly distant, immersed in his own world of business and power. Arguments between them became more frequent and bitter. "Where have you been?" Thomas demanded one night when Evelyn came home late. I needed some time to myself," she stammered, the smell of Jack's paint still on her clothes. Thomas eyed her suspiciously, his eyes narrowing. "You look different, Evelyn. What's going on?" At that moment, Evelyn felt the weight of her lies, the danger of her affair, and the emptiness of her marriage crushing her. She was on the edge of a precipice, knowing that her next decision would change everything forever. The silence between Evelyn and Thomas was palpable, filled with tension and unrevealed secrets. Evelyn felt her heart hammer against her chest, her hands shaking slightly as she struggled to find the right words. Thomas, she began, her voice trailing off. But before he could continue, Thomas's phone rang, breaking the moment. Blackwood, he answered brusquely, his eyes still fixed on Evelyn. After a few seconds, his expression changed. I understand. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. I have to go. Crisis in the company. We will continue this conversation later. And so, he left, leaving Evelyn alone with her turbulent thoughts and her divided heart. In the days that followed, Evelyn found herself in a spiral of conflicting emotions. Every moment with Jack was an explosion of passion and freedom, while every interaction with Thomas left her more guilty and anguished. One afternoon, in Jack's studio, Evelyn burst into tears. I can't go on like this, Jack. I'm tearing myself apart inside. Jack hugged her, his ink-stained fingers leaving marks on her skin. Then let's go, Evelyn. Leave everything behind. Start a new life with me. The proposal hung in the air, tempting and frightening at the same time. Evelyn closed her eyes, imagining a life away from obligations, the weight of expectations. But the image of Thomas, alone in his glass empire, haunted her. I don't know if I can, she whispered. Jack pulled away, his green eyes shining with an intensity Evelyn had never seen before. Do you love him? The question hit her like a punch. I don't know anymore. It was in this moment of vulnerability that Jack presented an idea that would change everything. His voice was low, almost a whisper, when he said, what if Thomas just disappeared? Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. What do you mean? Jack approached, his eyes shining with a mixture of passion and something darker. Think about it, Evelyn. With Thomas out of the way, you'd have it all, the freedom, the money, the two of us together. It would be perfect. Evelyn's world seemed to spin. She pulled away from Jack, shocked by the suggestion. Are you talking about killing Thomas? Jack took her hands, his voice urgent. No, not kill. Just make him disappear. An accident. Something that can't be traced back to us. Evelyn felt nauseous, her mind conflicted. Part of her was horrified at the idea, but another part, a part she barely recognized, considered the possibility. I need time to think, she stuttered, grabbing her bag and hurriedly leaving the studio. In the weeks that followed, the idea planted by Jack grew in Evelyn's mind like a weed. Every argument with Thomas, every moment of solitude in her life of empty luxury, pushed her further into Jack's plan. One night, after yet another heated argument with Thomas, Evelyn found herself dialing Jack's number with shaking hands. Let's do this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell me the plan. Jack meticulously explained every detail. A yacht accident during a business trip. A body that would never be found. A devastated widow, comforted by a close friend. As the day approached, Evelyn felt torn between paralyzing fear and dark excitement. She watched Thomas, memorizing every detail, knowing it would be the last moments. The day before the business trip, Evelyn prepared a special dinner for Thomas. As she watched him drink his favorite wine, she felt a pang of remorse. Is everything okay, sweetheart? Thomas asked, noticing her distant expression. Evelyn forced a smile. Yeah, just worried about your trip tomorrow. Thomas smiled, taking your hand across the table. Don't worry. I'll be back before you know it. That night, lying next to Thomas for the last time, Evelyn fought back tears. The plan was in motion, there was no turning back. Tomorrow, his life would change forever. As the sun rose, marking the beginning of that fateful day, Evelyn felt the weight of her decision. What would happen now? Would the plan work? And if so, could she live with the consequences of her actions? The sound of the phone echoed through the empty apartment, making Evelyn jump. Her hands shook as she answered, knowing this call would change everything. Mrs. Blackwood? The voice on the other end was deep, official. This is Captain Reeves of the Coast Guard. I'm sorry to inform you, but there's been an accident with your husband's yacht. Evelyn felt the world spin. Even though she knew this would happen, reality hit her like a punch in the stomach. No, it can't be, she whispered, her voice choked with tears that she didn't know if were real or rehearsed. The hours that followed were a blur of worried faces, endless questions, and a dull pain that Evelyn hadn't expected to feel. She played the role of the devastated widow to perfection, her anguish amplified by the gnawing guilt that consumed her from within. Days turned into weeks. The disembodied funeral, the endless condolences, the pitying looks, it all seemed surreal to Evelyn. She moved like an automaton, her mind wavering between guilty relief and unexpected sadness. One night, alone in the apartment that now seemed too big, Evelyn was surprised by a knock on the door. It was Jack. Hey Evelyn, he whispered, pulling her into a hug. It's done. We are free now. But instead of the joy she expected to feel, Evelyn was overcome by a wave of nausea. She pulled away from Jack, her eyes wide with horror. I free? She repeated, her voice shaking. Jack, we killed a man. Jack took her hands, his eyes shining with an almost manic intensity. We did what was necessary, my love. Now we can be together, without obstacles. Evelyn backed away, feeling suffocated. I need time, Jack. This is too much. The days that followed were a waking nightmare for Evelyn. Every shadow seemed to hide an accuser, every sympathetic look made her feel like a fraud. And Jack? Jack was changing. His once fiery passion now seemed obsessive, suffocating. One afternoon, while reviewing Thomas's estate documents, Evelyn made a shocking discovery. Thomas had changed his will weeks before his death, leaving a significant portion of his fortune to charity. But why? Evelyn muttered to herself, tears streaming down her face. Thomas, what were you planning? The guilt, already overwhelming, now threatened to consume her completely. Evelyn found herself questioning every moment, every decision that led her to this point. That night, unable to sleep, Evelyn wandered the apartment, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. She stopped in front of Thomas's portrait, her eyes fixed on the image of the man she had betrayed in the worst way possible. "Forgive me," she whispered, her voice broken with emotion. "I didn't know. I didn't understand." Suddenly, a noise at the door made her freeze. Evelyn turned around slowly, her heart hammering against her chest. The handle slowly turned and the door opened, revealing a figure that made Evelyn's blood run cold. There, standing in the doorway, alive and breathing, was Thomas Blackwood. Evelyn's world collapsed. Her face turned pale, her legs felt weak, and she felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The words caught in her throat as she stared at what could only be a ghost, a cruel hallucination from her guilt-ridden mind. Thomas stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Evelyn with an intensity that made her shiver. "Surprised to see me, darling?" His voice was cold, cutting like a blade of ice. Evelyn stumbled backwards, her mind spinning for an explanation, a way out, anything that might make sense in this surreal moment. "Thomas, how are you alive?" she stuttered, her voice barely above a whisper. A humorless smile curved Thomas's lips. "It seems your plan wasn't as perfect as you thought, right, Evelyn?" The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. He knew. Somehow, Thomas knew everything. Evelyn felt the world spin around her, the reality of her situation crashing down on her like an avalanche. "Thomas, I can explain," she began, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Thomas raised a hand, silencing her. "Don't worry, dear. We will have plenty of time for explanations. After all, the night is long, and we have so much to discuss." The tone of his voice made Evelyn shudder. She looked around, desperately looking for a way out, but she knew she was trapped. Not just physically in that apartment, but trapped in the consequences of her own actions. As Thomas closed the door behind him, the click of the lock sounded like a final sentence. Evelyn realized she was about to face trial for her choices, and the judge would be the man she had betrayed and tried to kill. The air in the apartment became heavy, charged with tension and secrets about to be revealed. What would happen now? How had Thomas survived? And more importantly, what did he plan to do with Evelyn? The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn felt every beat of her heart like thunder in her ears, while Thomas watched her with a look that mixed disappointment, anger, and something else. Something she couldn't decipher. "Why, Evelyn?" Thomas's voice broke the silence, full of suppressed emotion. "After everything we've built together, why?" Evelyn felt tears burning in her eyes. Her voice shook when she finally managed to speak. I felt so alone, Thomas. So empty. You were always so distant, so focused on business." Thomas took a step towards her, making Evelyn instinctively step back. And does that justify trying to kill me?" His voice was sharp like a razor. "No," Evelyn exclaimed, tears now running freely down her face. I didn't want to, it was Jack's idea. He said it would be the only way we could be together." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. Jack. Your artist lover. I must admit, it was an ingenious plan. But you underestimated my intelligence, dear." He walked to the bar, pouring himself a drink with frightening calm. "Do you want to know how I survived, Evelyn? How I found out everything?" Evelyn nodded silently, unable to form words. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel. New videos are coming out all the time, and you won't want to miss any of the excitement. "I always knew you were dissatisfied," Thomas began, twirling the glass in his hands. "But I never imagined it would come to this. That's when I noticed little changes in you, late arrivals, vague excuses. I hired a detective." Evelyn gasped, realization hitting her like a punch. Thomas continued. When I found out about Jack and heard about your plan, I decided to play your game. I faked my own death, watched from afar as you played the role of the grieving widow." He turned to face her, his eyes shining with a mix of pain and fury. "Do you know what hurt me the most, Evelyn? Seeing how relieved you seemed in the first few days after my death. Like a weight had been lifted from your shoulders. Evelyn felt her legs weaken and leaned against the nearest wall. Thomas, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what I was doing. Please, you have to believe me. Thomas took another step towards her, his proximity making Evelyn shiver. I believe you? How can I believe a word that comes out of your mouth right now, Evelyn? At that moment, the sound of a key turning in the lock made them both freeze. The door opened, revealing Jack, who stopped abruptly upon seeing the scene before him. Evelyn? What are... Her words trailed off when her eyes fell on Thomas. Impossible. Thomas smiled, a cold, calculating smile. I'm glad you joined us, Jack. Now we can have a full family reunion. The air in the apartment became electrically charged. Evelyn looked from Thomas to Jack, her heart beating so hard she feared it might explode at any moment. Jack took a hesitant step into the apartment, his eyes never leaving Thomas. How did you? I survived? Thomas completed. Let's just say I'm smarter than you thought. Evelyn felt the world spin around her. Everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, was crumbling before her eyes. What are you going to do to us? She whispered, dreading the answer. Thomas looked from Evelyn to Jack, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. That, my dear, is the big question, isn't it? What do you do with a cheating wife and her murderous lover? The silence that followed was heavy, filled with fear and anticipation. Evelyn knew that Thomas's next move would determine not only their future, but possibly their own lives. As the three stared at each other, the air seemed to vibrate with unresolved tension and secrets about to be revealed. What would Thomas do? What would be the fate of Evelyn and Jack? And more importantly, was there any chance of redemption after such betrayal? The night was far from over, and Evelyn had the terrible feeling that the worst was yet to come. The silence that hovered in the apartment was almost palpable, broken only by the rapid breathing of the three occupants. Thomas, with a calculating look, slowly moved towards the coffee table where a leather briefcase rested. You know, Evelyn, he began, his voice dangerously calm, while I was watching you and your friend here plotting my death, I also made some plans. He opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents. Evelyn felt her stomach drop, anticipating the worst. What is that? Jack asked, his voice betraying a tremor of fear. Thomas smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. That, my dear Jack, is the end of your game. He took out a document and handed it to Evelyn. With shaking hands, she picked it up, her eyes widening as she read. No. She whispered, horror evident in her voice. Thomas, you can't. Oh, but I can, darling, Thomas replied, his voice now filled with restrained fury. Every penny you thought you would inherit? Now belongs to charities. Every property, every share, everything. You will have nothing. Jack stepped forward, his face contorted with rage. You bastard. You can't do this to her. Thomas turned to Jack, his eyes glowing dangerously. As for you, my artist friend, I have something special in store. He took another document from the folder and threw it at Jack's feet. A detailed expose of your participation in the plot to kill me. With enough evidence to ensure you spend a good amount of time behind bars. Jack's face paled, all previous bravado disappearing in an instant. Evelyn felt her legs give out and fell to her knees, tears now flowing freely. Thomas, please, she begged, her voice cracking with emotion. I know we made a terrible mistake, but there must be another way. Thomas looked at her, and for a moment, Evelyn saw a glimpse of the man she had once loved. But as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared. Another way? He repeated, his voice thick with bitterness. How do you think I felt, Evelyn, knowing that the woman I loved, gave everything to, was plotting my death? Evelyn sobbed, guilt and regret consuming her. I'm so sorry, Thomas. I'm really sorry. I was so lost, so alone. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment as if fighting an internal battle. When he opened them again, there was an iron determination in his gaze. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice firm. Hey Evelyn, you will leave this house now, with nothing but the clothes on your back. Jack, you have 24 hours to leave the country, or these documents will go straight to the police. Jack looked at Evelyn, desperation evident in his eyes. Evelyn, we can run away together. Start over somewhere else. But Evelyn barely heard him. Her world was crumbling around her, and she found herself staring into the void of a future she herself had destroyed. Thomas approached her, crouching to the same level. For a moment, Evelyn saw a mixture of emotions in his eyes: anger, sadness, and perhaps, deep down, a hint of love. Why, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice now barely above a whisper. "After everything we've been through together, why did you do this?" Evelyn looked into the eyes of the man she had betrayed so deeply, feeling the weight of her actions like never before. I don't know, Thomas. I lost my way, I lost myself. And in the process, I lost you too." Thomas stood up abruptly, turning his back to her. "Go," he said, his voice thick with restrained emotion. Both. Now." Evelyn stood up slowly, her legs barely supporting her. She took one last look at the apartment that had been her home, at the life she had thrown away. Jack was already at the door, his face a mask of fear and regret. As she walked towards the exit, Evelyn stopped for a moment next to Thomas. "I really loved you, you know," she whispered. Thomas didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders tense. "I loved you too, Evelyn. And that is the greatest punishment of all." If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel. New videos are coming out all the time, and you won't want to miss any of the excitement. With those final words ringing in her ears, Evelyn left the apartment, leaving behind not only her life of luxury, but also the fragments of her shattered heart. As the elevator descended, taking her to an uncertain future, Evelyn found herself confronting the consequences of her choices. The empire she had helped build, the love she had wasted, all gone in the blink of an eye. The elevator doors opened onto the cold New York night, and Evelyn took her first step into a world that no longer recognized her as the powerful Mrs. Blackwood. Now, she was just Evelyn, a woman who had everything and lost it all because of her own actions. The city's cold wind enveloped her, a cruel metaphor for the icy reality she now faced. With every step she took away from the building, Evelyn felt the weight of her choices, the price of her betrayal, and the pain of a love lost forever. The city that once lay at his feet now seemed like a frightening maze of unknown possibilities. But as she walked through the busy streets, mingling with the anonymous crowd, Evelyn knew that this was just the first page of a new chapter in her life, a chapter of redemption, of self-discovery and, perhaps one day, of forgiveness.